No introductory remarks would be possible without mention of the fact that we meet at a rather grim and dispiriting moment, something far different from when we planned this event. With the murder of a staggering 1,300 Israelis on October 7th, and headlines like the one in today's New York Times that tells us, for Europe's Jews, a world of fear. Well, obviously there is a cloud of foreboding today that accompanies this event. But it is also in keeping with Jewish tradition to keep the light of learning lit, no matter the circumstances, and to revere scholars and those who support scholarship. And so I am deeply pleased that we can inaugurate this, the Academy's newest fellowship. It's a great honor and a pleasure to welcome the person who made this fellowship possible, Carol Kahn Strauss. Right here. Anyway, I know we're all thrilled that Carol has traveled here from that other promised land, New York City, to join us here today. And she will take the floor in just a few minutes to introduce our speaker. I have the august task of introducing the introducer. So some of you will have heard, probably from me or from others, the story behind this fellowship, namely that I met Carol by accident in a New York restaurant in the same building that houses the American Academy's office in New York. I knew of Carol by reputation, who doesn't? And I knew that she had been a pivotal and perhaps the pivotal person in Jewish-German relations for several decades through her work as the head of the Leo Baeck Institute. So I took the opportunity of meeting her to ask if I could get her advice on potential funders for a Jewish Studies Fellowship that I wanted to establish at the Academy. She asked to see the proposal so that she could think about it. I sent it to her, and within, I think, 48 hours, maybe 24, she responded that she would establish the fellowship. Well, needless to say, I was, to use a medical and technical term, flabbergasted. And the experience also led me to the belief that fundraising was really quite an easy task. And that is a conclusion that I have been disabused of almost every day since. Subsequent frustration notwithstanding, I'm really delighted about this extraordinary gift and the fact that we now have a fellowship named in perpetuity for Carol Kahn Strauss. The fellowship enables us to bring one scholar in Jewish studies annually to the Academy's Hans Arnold Center for a semester-long residency in Berlin. And this will decisively anchor the Academy's strong tradition of hosting scholars from the various academic disciplines that comprise Jewish studies. And since in the Jewish tradition as well, study, research, and scholarship are essential for repairing the world for Tikkun Olam, I am really pleased that Carol and the Academy can make this contribution. So now to the formalities of the introduction. Many of you know Carol as the longtime director of Leo Baeck, a renowned figure in German-American relations, and the recipient of the Commander's Cross of the Order of Merit, the Großes Bundesverdienstkreuz, as well as the Ellis Island Medal of Honor. If you haven't seen Carol in the Bundesverdienstkreuz that she has, that's probably because you couldn't see her behind the Bundesverdienstkreuz because it's so large. A native of New York, she was born into a distinguished Jewish family that had come to the United States after fleeing Nazi Germany. Her father had been the president of the district court in Dortmund when he was expelled from his post in 1934. After Kristallnacht, after the pogroms of 1938, he and his family left Germany just in the nick of time. Carol studied political science at Columbia and Hunter College. She was a senior editor at the Hudson Institute, and in one of those really interesting connections in history, she was an assistant to the very famous Hermann Kahn, correct? And I'm just glad that she turned to Jewish-German relations and not nuclear weapons, but I'm sure she would have been equally good at that. She was also books editor at the Council on Foreign Relations. She was president of Congregation Habonim in Manhattan, and at the Leo Baeck Institute, I tried to confirm the dates of her leadership there, and she was evasive. So let me just say that under her leadership, a branch of the Leo Baeck Institute was opened here in Berlin in July of 2013. She maintains deep relations with, I should say, just about everyone you can imagine in Germany. And it's worth noting that at this year's Presseball in Berlin, the biggest event of the social season, she was seated next to someone named Frank-Walter Steinmeier. Carol has made fostering German-Jewish relations and continuous cooperation with these two communities really the central theme of her life, and we are profoundly grateful to her for her commitment to this institution. Now, let me just say one word about the evening before I invite Carol up to introduce her first fellow. After Carol's introduction, David will present his lecture, and then you will have a chance to ask questions. If you are joining us by Zoom, please do put your questions in the Q&A part of the Zoom, and we will do the best to get answers to all of your questions. And everyone else here knows what to do in the Q&A. So with that, Carol, welcome. Special podium for you, Carol.
Very cool. Thank you. Thank you. That's good. Yeah. Well, Dan's introduction is exceedingly generous, and I am very, very appreciative. But I must say that when I met with Dan and he presented me with a proposal, it was so compelling and so beautifully written and so thoughtful and included so many things that really mattered in the history and culture of German Jewry that for me, it was like, if I can do this, I will. So my first call was to my lawyer, and I said, can I do this? And the second one was to Dan, and said, I can do this. So that's the whole story, and you're right. I made it too easy for you. Right, exactly, right. But I will say that, as Dan mentioned, you can't really stand here in this week or these days without realizing that for Jews, the concept of never again has no operational relevance. I mean, we always need to be diligent, aware, and recognize our vulnerability. And one way we can protect ourselves a little bit, perhaps, is by studying what has come before and the conclusions and lessons to be drawn. And I think there could be no better venue for undertaking those assignments than the American Academy in Berlin. Now, over the many years that I was the director of Leo Baeck Institute, I had an annual dinner every year. And among the honored guests, it was my privilege to introduce Kurt Masur, Margareta von Trotta, President Rao, Henry Kissinger, Jim Wilkinson, Anselm Kiefer. I mean, a very long and illustrious list, and I had the pleasure and the privilege of saying, it is my honor to introduce. It was, but truly, no one who I have had the pleasure and privilege of introducing has really touched my heart the way this first Carol Kahn Strauss Fellow in Jewish Studies does. I mean, this really, really is very close to everything I have pretty well spent my life, focusing on, and it means a great deal to me. So we have about 11 pages of David Price's credentials that I have been asked to read, and I'm happy to do it. He's a professor in the departments of Jewish Studies, Religious Studies, Art History, and History at Vanderbilt University. His degrees are from Cincinnati and Yale. I'm editing this, David. You will understand. He was at Yale, he was at Texas, at Austin, Southern Methodist, and University of Illinois at Urbana. He's authored many books. His most recent is a monograph titled In the Beginning Was the Image, Art and the Reformation Bible. David's other books include Johannes Reuchlin and the Campaign to Destroy Jewish Books, Albert Durer's Renaissance, etc. I will say that the original Reuchlin-Pfefferkorn correspondence is at Leo Baeck Institute. He focuses on Jewish writers who began addressing Christian readers in their theological and religious works. Okay, you don't need to know them all, truly. David is really an expert in art. He is an expert in history. He is an expert in Judaica. So I don't know how you can come up with a better fellow, Dan, than David Price. It's truly, truly an honor. Thank you.
A little more. Okay. Thank you, Carol, for the kind words, and thanks for the money. Thanks for the fellowship. I really appreciate it. And thank to all of you for coming tonight to launch the Carol Kahn Strauss lecture series in Jewish Studies at the American Academy in Berlin. It's a very happy event that we're celebrating, that Jewish Studies will be a permanent fixture at the American Academy. But of course, all of us, whatever our cultural orientation or background may be, are celebrating this moment with a tremendous weight of sorrow and worry and fear in our hearts. I'm looking forward to the future, truly longing to see how the Carol Kahn Strauss Lecture on Jewish Studies develops in happier circumstances. I want to add that just a little bit, that a lot of my research has been devoted to studying the history of anti-Semitism in the 16th century, which tragically is a very large field of study, even when limited to this one century. But I'm also interested in studying how Judaism survived in numerous places, despite the devastating persecutions of the Middle Ages and the early modern period. Along those lines, I'm now working on a project titled Listening to Jewish Voices, on the importance of Jewish contributions to the expansion of religious toleration in the 17th and 18th centuries. Given the centuries of persecution, it may surprise you that Jews did not write defenses of Judaism or descriptions of Judaism for Christian readers until 1637. But once they started doing so, which happened in the work of two charismatic rabbis, Manasseh ben Israel and Leon Modena, their impact was far-reaching, in some cases transformative. The book will explore Jewish contributions up into the French Revolution, and while I'm in Berlin, I'm hoping to finish the final chapter, an interpretation of the career of Moses Mendelssohn, probably the most influential advocate of religious toleration in the Jewish tradition. This will be the one time, I hope, that I will finish the project for a fellowship, during the fellowship. I think I can. Although my book focuses primarily on Jewish writers, I've included a few chapters on important cases of Christians who adapted and promoted Jewish works, as, for example, our focus this evening, the artist and publisher Bernard Picart. There are many ways to approach Picart's art, but this evening I want to consider one of his projects, his engraved portrayal of Jewish life, as a way of studying the significance of Leon Modena's Guide to Judaism for Christians. I'm hoping that this talk will exemplify a way of analyzing what I've come to call the composite Christian-Jewish discourse that arose as Christians started to respond to the new Jewish voices in the public sphere. One background point: it's important for us to keep in mind that the century preceding Leon Modena marked the nadir for Jewish interests in Western Europe, obviously the nadir apart from the Holocaust. By the 16th century, after the large-scale expulsions from Spain and Portugal, and the earlier expulsions from England and France, as well as hundreds of smaller banishments, Western European Judaism had receded very close to the vanishing point. Yet by the end of the century, the political tide started to turn. Although expulsion campaigns did not end, they subsided dramatically, and several territories began readmitting Jews or permitting new communities to form where they had never previously existed. Probably the most familiar example to us is the readmission of Jews to England in the 1650s after a banishment that lasted for over 350 years. And I should mention the readmission to Berlin, all of electoral Brandenburg, in 1671. Many others. Why did this major change occur? The consensus view among historians, which I fully share, is that fiscal and mercantile calculations drove the shift more than any other factor. As mercantilism became increasingly hegemonic in Western European governments, a favorable environment crystallized for weighing the benefits of permitting Jewish residency. Even so, the venom of anti-Semitism had seeped so pervasively and so destructively into Christian cultures of all confessions that benign portrayals of Judaism became a necessity for the gradual expansion of legal toleration. The inflammatory innuendos of Christian polemicists completely dominated the early modern public discourse, entrenching a hateful view of the religion and the people as being so depraved and so dangerous that no economic rationale could ever justify tolerating their residency. Many Christians, although certainly not all, believed God was punishing the Jews for executing Jesus, and, perhaps more threatening, that contemporary Jews were hatching plots to destroy Christian society, including murdering Christian children and using their blood in religious rituals. Thus, despite the positive trajectory, legal toleration of Judaism remained highly contested. A breakthrough figure for the emergence of this new Jewish-Christian discourse was Leon Modena, a rabbi in the Venetian ghetto, a productive scholar and charismatic preacher who developed an extremely extensive network of connections with Christian scholars, clerics, and above all, diplomats across Europe. His history of Jewish rituals, the life and observances of the Jews today, is a comprehensive account of Jewish life, the first one ever written by a Jewish author for Christian readers. An important feature of his landmark book is that it was not his idea to write or publish it. According to Modena, Christian associates pressed him to compose such a work specifically as a corrective to the available accounts that were, in the words of his first editor, rampant with ignorance, lies, overwrought with burning hatred. Modena himself tells us that the work was originally commissioned by English diplomats for a presentation to James I of England. We don't know if that ever happened, but manuscripts did circulate in England and France before the manual was first printed by a prominent Christian scholar, Jacques Gaffarel, in Paris. The work was translated by Christians into Dutch, English, 3 separate English translations that yielded a total of 6 imprints, French, German, and Latin, in addition to being reprinted in the original Italian some 8 times. All of these editions, especially the introductions, stress the authenticity and therefore reliability of the rabbinic voice, almost always in contrast to the distortions of earlier anti-Jewish writers, many of whom were Jewish converts to Christianity with twisted perspectives on their former faith. Of the many translations, the most important was Richard Simon's French version of 1674, which he published under a new title, The Customs and the Ceremonies and Customs Practiced Among the Jews Today, a version that would be reprinted over a dozen times. Simon undertook his Modena translation just after publishing a pamphlet in urgent defense of the Jewish community of Metz in France, which was engulfed in an expulsion campaign after a tragic blood libel case in 1670. The Jewish victim was executed, but the community was spared the banishment. In that pamphlet, he mentioned that Christian judges needed to be well instructed in Jewish law and custom in order to issue just rulings in cases like this. Evidently, he sought to rectify that dangerous ignorance by translating Modena. Simon also composed a supplemental treatise that compared Jewish and Christian practices, often vouching for the historical integrity of contemporary Judaism, sometimes at the expense of Christianity. Simon claimed that important Christian rituals are Jewish, and even more remarkably that, quote, the doctrine of the two religions is nearly the same, end of quote. As of 1681, his comparison was always included in the French, Dutch, and Latin reprints of Modena. The impact of Modena's presentation of Judaism is difficult to overestimate. The work became a ubiquitous source, distributed widely, cited in virtually every subsequent Christian work on Judaism for over 100 years. For example, the first English translation was prepared and printed in 1650, just as the movement to readmit Jews was getting started in London. Jacques Bernard, often credited as the founder of modern Jewish historiography, used Modena as the primary authority for describing Jewish practices. Bernard did this in his landmark 1716 History of the Jews, a work described by one historian as, quote, the origin and inspiration of the pro-Jewish tradition in the Enlightenment. Another example is our focus this evening, the influence of Modena and Simon on Bernard Picart and his collaborator, Jean-Frédéric Bernard, as they launched their encyclopedic overview of the known religions of the world, the religious ceremonies and customs of all the peoples of the world. Picart devoted the inaugural volume to the portrayal of Judaism and began the ambitious project with a full text reprint of Modena's manual, followed by Simon's comparative study. Most importantly, Picart designed a large suite of engravings with authentic representations of contemporary Jewish life as another Christian supplement to Modena. The project would be Picart's greatest publishing success. At least 17 printings would appear in French, English, Dutch, and German, and Picart's engravings became a foundation for the visual perception of contemporary Judaism, by far the most influential images of Jews during the era. Let me say a few words about Picart before we continue. He enjoyed great commercial success as a print artist, probably was the best-known engraver of his generation in all of Europe. He had a large workshop in Paris, but as a crypto-Calvinist, he relocated his flourishing business to Amsterdam in the aftermath of the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, which outlawed the practice of Protestantism in France. Unfortunately, we do not have explicit documentation for Picart's theological proclivities, but most evidence suggests that at the very least he was highly receptive to the Enlightenment critique of religion, especially to the Enlightenment critiques of violence associated with enforcement of orthodoxy. He almost certainly never developed or expressed a concept of universal religious liberty. This is something we can infer from his implacable animus for Roman Catholicism in many compositions. Moreover, and important to note for our subject, one of his works, admittedly a minor one, portrays the anti-Jewish concept of supersessionism. I mention these matters not because they are surprising, they are not, but rather to alert us to the need to problematize Picart's concept of toleration before we start looking at his images of Judaism. As with Modena's history of the Jewish rituals, Authenticity is the authorizing principle for Picart's discourse. In his case, the desire for authenticity informed the development of a novel technique of basing his engravings on sketches of specific celebrations of Jewish holidays and life cycle rituals. This, in turn, informs a compositional principle that we might think of as a snapshot style of representation. Most of his compositions are intended to capture candid moments that create an illusion of seeing Jewish life in action. And he developed a special way of signing his plates. If the plate was based on a life study, he signed it this way, that he dessiné d'après nature gravé par Bernard Picart. But if it wasn't, he's very scrupulous. If it's not, he signed the plate in a way like this, that he just directed the engraving. Sometimes the plates are signed that so-and-so inwane it. In other words, completely made up the engraving. But those are for the other religions. The plates for Judaism, with one exception, are d'après nature, life studies of Judaism. An important, though complex, passage in the earliest biography of Picart confirms that the Jewish plates are not only illustrations of the information in Modena Simon, but also fresh eyewitness documentation of contemporary Judaism. In particular, the biography tells us that the great Amsterdam merchant, Nathan Coriel, invited Picart to his 1725 Passover Seder. And reading a little bit from this statement in the plates for the ceremony of the Jews are completely his design, and several of the same were engraved by him. Some of those caused him a great deal of effort because of the reluctance of most Jews to let someone not of their religion see several of their ceremonies. Just for the ceremony of Passover, he was obliged to make entreaties for over 4 years before being able to see it. And that plate, which I have there for you, obviously, which is unquestionably one of the most interesting, would have remained missing if Nathan Coriel, the ambassador of Portugal, had not been willing to admit him to that ceremony. He had the goodness of explaining to him quite precisely all the specifics. The synagogues, the furniture, the clothing, the tabernacles, etc., were all made from life drawings. And since it had never been done before in that fashion, all the world, both Jews and Christians, were charmed by them. The suite of plates, this is the only plate not drawn from nature, by the way, not drawn in a life study. The suite of plates opens dramatically with a double folio engraving of the interior of the Portuguese synagogue. Thus, the reader enters the world of Judaism by walking into the famous Esnoga, which the accompanying text acclaims as, quote, the most beautiful synagogue in the world. Though imposing in its monumentality, the Esnoga's architecture creates a wonderful interplay of grandeur and simplicity, a quality that comes through strongly in several Picart engravings. Moreover, as the work of a Christian architect, Elias Bouwman, the Esnoga exploits the same classicizing idiom that informs contemporary Dutch Reformed churches in Amsterdam. And you can see the Roman barrel vault, the classical architrave, the Ionic capitals on the columns, among other classicizing features. A distinctive aspect of Picart's depictions is the extensive participation of Christians in Jewish society. In our first engraving, he portrays Christian dignitaries with considerable flourish as they join the Jewish community to celebrate the dedication of the synagogue. By my count, he includes nearly 30 Christians in the picture. They are mostly noticeable in the foreground, in front of a low balustrade, elegantly attired and easily identifiable as Christians, mainly because the men are not wearing prayer shawls or head coverings. This woman, who makes eye contact with the viewer, is a special repoussoir figure, a Christian woman who draws the viewer into the Jewish space. He does this in 2 other instances as well. Several Christians, altogether another dozen or so, populate the other engravings as guests at Jewish observances. This is strikingly evident in the circumcision scene, where a Christian woman, prominently wearing a cross pendant, stands in the foreground right and directs attention to the circumcision. The kneeling man on the left is likely a Christian intent on observing and understanding the actual circumcision. And it's important that he is not at all disturbed by the ritual. In fact, the Jewish father, standing behind the seated godfather and holding a glass of wine, appears far more concerned than any of the relaxed Christian guests. In a general way, the presence of Christians normalizes the ritual for a Christian viewer, and perhaps more specifically, the Christian-Jewish sociability in this composition obliterates any connection with blood libel pictures, which sometimes evoke circumcision as part of the anti-Semitic trope. The depiction of Rosh Hashanah, an image signed as being drawn from life in 1725, also pays tribute to the grandeur of the Portuguese synagogue. Yet here, too, Picart emphasizes social interaction as much as ritual. Indeed, the blowing of the ram's horn, the shofar, the most familiar part of the liturgy, is hardly the visual focus. Instead, Picart offers a lateral sweep of the entire bima, the entire speaking and reading platform, placing the shofar off-center to the right. As in subsequent images, this one provides a glimpse of an actual service, a moment that captures the life of the synagogue as well as the character of the Jewish men, some of whom are rather less interested in the intonation of the shofar and more inclined to continue their discussions. On the one hand, to a Christian eye, the Jews might initially appear somewhat distinctive because they are draped in various ways in their prayer shawls. It looks like a kind of study in different ways to put on your prayer shawl almost. But the talitot are not particularly concealing, and beneath them we see smartly attired men. They're relaxed, some slouching comfortably in their chairs, not at all in a state of deep or otherworldly devotion. Rather, Picart is peering beyond the formalities of the ceremonies and representing the Jews as sophisticated men of culture with the trappings of success, gathered together as the leaders of their community. Their shaven faces, long hair coiffed with waves and curls, three-cornered hats, fine shoes and stockings make them paragons of the ambient style of high society, potentially indistinguishable from fashionable Christian peers. Moreover, the sense of a rational and orderly frame of mind pervades the setting, as I think often happens. Overall, I think a pattern will start to emerge, namely that Picart portrays Jewish society as being compatible with the aspirations of a Protestant merchant class, in part even as an idealization of that class. We might see that as a powerful strategy for undermining anti-Judaism, as it no doubt was. Yet it also reveals an important limitation on Picart's ideology of toleration, as it strongly valorizes affinity to the dominant culture. Fittingly, perhaps, Yom Kippur is something of an exception, for it does not focus on elegant attire or social interaction, or even on the architectural artistry of the setting in the Obene Shul, which is a smaller Ashkenaz synagogue in Amsterdam. The engraving is a tour de force of chiaroscuro, used here to create a devotional atmosphere, especially effective for evoking Kol Nidre, the evening service that begins Yom Kippur. The style recalls the many Caravaggisti of the 17th century who exploited chiaroscuro, often to portray a divine presence. In this case, the Jews are immersed in their prayer books, draped in prayer shawls, wearing simple white robes called kittels. Almost 24 candles illuminate the synagogue, casting just enough light on their kittels and also on their faces to dispel any potential gloominess. And importantly, making individual portraits stand out. The divergent poses and focuses of the men, as well as the dramatic lighting, make the group portrait complex, but also fascinating and inviting, and it invites the viewer to ponder the Jews individually as they begin to observe the holiest day. Let me add that Yom Kippur is not the only depiction of Jewish piety. A strong religious aura also emerges from plates that depict reverence for the Torah, as is especially evident in this elevation of the Torah. I like to mention these examples because they are not images of assimilation or familiarity, yet they seem capable of fostering respect for the practices of another faith. The plates for the holidays of Sukkot and Passover also provide a glimpse of Jewish life while illustrating customs. One Passover engraving depicts a family of 5 engaged in the customary search for chametz, leaven products that must be removed from the house before the beginning of Passover. For us, the search reveals that a Jewish home does not differ from a non-Jewish home. On one level, the picture simply evokes the cleanliness and industry of an ideal kitchen. It's a kitchen finished out with Dutch tiles, no less. The virtuoso handling of light penetrating the windows allows Picart to suggest that the entire extended household is engaged in systematic preparations of the kitchen for Passover. The father on the floor is using a traditional feather to whisk chametz from a cabinet. A mother and 2 daughters stand in the center of the room making final preparations, which involves a common Jewish custom, scattering a few crumbs of chametz, which ensures that some chametz will be found in the search. Most endearingly, the younger daughter clutches her toy pony stick while watching. To a Christian viewer, this looks primarily like a fortunate family bonding in an enjoyable pastime, and perhaps only secondarily like the rituals of an unfamiliar religion. At the very least, it portrays a harmonious combination of work, pleasure, and religious practice. The second Passover scene depicts a Seder, the symbolic meal that commemorates the flight from bondage in Egypt. Most of the participants have octavo-sized pamphlets in their hands, the Haggadahs, which are read during the Seder to tell the story of Exodus and to reflect on its meaning. Moreover, the participants are rendered in highly finished, individualized portraits, even if it's no longer possible to identify each of them with confidence. We can only infer that the head of the family on the upper left is the accommodating and powerful merchant Nathan Curiel. It is possible that Picart has recorded his own presence as the man on the left at the table without a head covering. Although one scholar has suggested maybe it's Curiel's grandson. It would be strange without a kippah, though. As in other compositions, the uncertainty about the religious identity of a figure speaks volumes. For in several cases, we do not have clear markers that differentiate a Jew from a Christian neighbor. I might add that possibly Picart chose to depict this moment in the Seder, which is the distribution of pieces of the matzah bread, because Richard Simon analyzed the Last Supper of Jesus at great length in the accompanying text as a celebration of the Passover Seder. Picart also incorporates poverty into the representations of Jewish life. Surely a realistic detail, but probably also an evocation of the moral imperative of providing charity for the poor. The elevation of the Torah, which depicts Shabbat in the Portuguese synagogue in The Hague, has the strongest acknowledgement of the poor in the community. We see a man in tattered clothing with a leg stretched out as if disabled on the edge of the bima, as well as a child in ragged clothing at the corner. He also has paupers in 2 other scenes, which I'm going to skip over. Yet another reference to poverty and charity occurs in the depiction of funeral rites. This plate, the final one of the book, depicts a stone epitaph whose Portuguese inscription seems to express an emblematic motto for Jewish ethics, quote, "Charity is the escape from death," the lower part of the epitaph. All of this expands on a leitmotif in Modena that contemporary Jews should be admired for their extraordinary charity to the poor. Part 1 of Modena's Introduction to Judaism, for example, concludes with a long chapter that describes Jewish charitable organizations as well as the individual obligation to be charitable, emphasizing repeatedly that charity extends to Jews and non-Jews everywhere. Quoting Modena, "They acknowledge that it is a good work to give alms and to relieve every person in affliction, even when they are not Jewish, for acts of charity are due to all humankind without distinction," end quote, from Modena. Simon, Banage, and many other Christian writers would emphasize charity so much that it became a standard trope in Christian Jewish discourse. For their part, Picart and Bernard added a note to Modena's chapter saying, quote, "We agree with Modena. The Jews are charitable in the extreme," end quote. In several plates, Picart also represents disturbing aspects of Jewish conformity with the ideals of Dutch society. Most importantly, an uncritical association with colonialism and racist ideology. Possibly there's a slight reference to the long-distance colonial trade in the Jewish burial plate where we see the masts and riggings of 2 ships in the background. Another, less subtle allusion is in the visual glorification of the Torah Ark of the Portuguese synagogue. This is one of the most renowned Torah arks in the Jewish tradition, an elegant neoclassical design, universally admired for its simplicity, which, by the way, is perfectly compatible with the iconoclastic aesthetics of Calvinism. But the Torah Ark of the Esnoga is also always celebrated for another reason, as an icon of the colonial trade. As emphasized by Picart in the text, and everyone else who comments on it for that matter, the Esnoga's Torah Ark is made of luminous Brazilian jacaranda wood imported from America at tremendous expense by the Curiel family. Above all, we need to consider the presence of a black man in livery, possibly an enslaved African, who appears in 3 separate domestic scenes of the Sephardi. In the present image, the Seder we've seen before, the servant is sitting at the table for the Passover Seder, even though, unlike the other guests, he is still working. This unusual situation calls for an explanation which the engraved legend provides. Quote, all the Jewish servants are at the same table with the family. Thus, this caption seems to identify the black man as being Jewish, and I should mention that there is ample documentation for the conversion of black Africans, free or enslaved, in early modern Amsterdam, including records of the burial of blacks in the Sephardic cemetery. I'm showing you here a composite with all 3 images of the black men. This strikes me as an unintended but nonetheless stark evocation of the racism underpinning Dutch colonialism and the Atlantic trade, also a sign of the complicity of Sephardic merchants of some Sephardic merchants, I should say, in the slave trade. Let me conclude briefly. Some of the most striking results of Picart's project arise from his decision to portray Judaism of the Dutch Republic to exemplify the description of contemporary Judaism that he adopts from Leon Modena. This would be a tremendous distortion of the conditions of Judaism worldwide. Nonetheless, this does not contradict his artistic commitment to authentic representation, d'après nature, because the selection of the Dutch Republic and the over-representation of the Amsterdam elite precondition that result. Picart's recontextualization of Modena's Guide to Jewish Life for Christians creates a powerful impression because it visualizes contemporary Jews as a vibrant and successful part of European society. And yet, I should rephrase this and say that Picard's recontextualization visualizes contemporary Jews as part of white European society, for we have encountered some of the most important perspectival limitations that can undermine early modern discourses of religious toleration. Jews are acceptable in large part because they are compatible with the ideals of the ambient Dutch society, even if those ideals are fraught with the oppressive, and in this case, I believe, unchallenged ideologies of colonialism and racism. For my book as a whole, it's important for me to emphasize that Picart magnified Leon Modena's impact tremendously, for he not only reframed Modena's work as part of the emerging Enlightenment discourse of toleration of Judaism, but he also significantly expanded and amplified the reach of this Jewish voice. Thank you. So, if there are questions.
First, let me thank you for this very, very thrilling talk and all these images. I never saw them. So this is opening up another perspective for me. But I was wondering, did the Pope in Rome in any way react? And did his administration, I would call it administration, highly hierarchical, react to these publications?
Yeah. Did you say the Pope?
The Pope.
It was immediately put on the index of prohibited books. Immediately. It had very little impact on the sales, though, but it was immediately outlawed. But we don't have any explanation. I guess it's just obvious why it was. One of the strange things about the printing history of it is that one of the imprints is from Paris, done by Catholics, and they just reshaped the text somewhat for the whole project, so that's a great question, and yes, they reacted. And in Modena's text he submitted his text. So it was first published in Paris in the original Italian, and then the publisher started marketing it in Rome, of all places. And then Modena in Venice got really nervous and decided he needed to bring out a second edition because he thought a few things sounded a little bit anti-Catholic, but it really doesn't sound Catholic. But anyway, he's worried. And he submitted to the Inquisition in Venice. It got condemned privately. We don't know exactly what he did, but he made some adjustments, and then it came out with a license of the Inquisitor of Venice. So his got then a Catholic licensing. Sometimes the Inquisition could be advantageous for Jewish publications because sometimes it licensed something.
David, thank you for a great lecture. It was just what I was hoping for. In the first plate, I think that you showed of the snow guy. I think that was it.
Okay, the interior?
Yes.
Okay.
As you mentioned, there's all those different people milling around, some of whom are Jewish and some of whom are Gentile.
Yeah.
And no, it was at the very beginning. And so that one, yeah. And so the question I have, everything is done from nature. Do we have any documentary evidence that there were so many non-Jews attending the synagogue at any time? Or was he putting his finger on the scale?
Yeah. Okay. Let me start with a little background. This is the one plate that's not done done from a life study. It's constructed based it's based on the interior of the synagogue, and then he invented all of these people. And the dedication was 1675, and this plate's from, what did it say, 1721? So he obviously wasn't there for the dedication. All the other stuff's authentic. This one's not. He signs it that way too. It's not authentic. He had a plate, and he also had access to it. But that plate was from 1675, and all of the people, the Christians, are wearing fashionable clothing for 1675. So what he did was reconceptualized it with the fashions of his day. It's kind of funny. And I often just think, well, he's from Paris. He's fashion means something, so he changed it all. But yes, we Manasseh ben Israel, a rabbi in Amsterdam, before this, Manasseh ben Israel died in 1656. In a defense of Judaism, he discussed some allegations that Jews curse Christians in the liturgy at a couple places. These are tropes in anti-Judaism among Christians. And he said, we could never do this. The synagogue's full of Christians all the time. There's just no way we could do that. And so we have a lot of evidence, a tremendous amount of evidence, occasionally even problems with crowd control. For example, there was for Leon Modena, for Simchat Torah, a very special celebration, the same holiday that the massacre occurred on. For Simchat Torah, one year, he had a special music program, Modena did, and the Christian, and it attracted a huge Christian crowd, including nobles, to the synagogue. And the Christian authorities had to come and limit attendance because it was dangerous. There were just too many people in the synagogue. So that he wrote about this problem. So in these places we have really pretty good evidence that Christians were regularly checking things out. The synagogue became a tourist attraction almost immediately, so William III, not surprisingly, visited as a tourist, and then he is said to have paid for turning the columns on the side aisles, converting them from wood to stone. So a Christian donation. We don't have to. It's just said that he did that. So there's, and then of course, the part of what's going on, of course, is that Christian Hebraists are very eager to have an authentic experience of a Jewish liturgy. So we have some people who are going there who are actually very good at Hebrew and have studied the liturgy somewhat. Most of them are there for things like the music. And it's really at this point, historically, that we start to get a kind of stereotype of Jewish musicality at this point. Modena, by the way, is the first person to edit music with the notes and Hebrew, with the exception of a little thing that Johannes Reusling did. He's the first to do this, and he brought out an edition of Salomone de Rossi, who's the first he's the first editor of Salomone de Rossi. And of course, Salomone de Rossi was really moving in between Christian and Jewish worlds in Mantua, and then also with the connections to Venice. Sorry, too long. Sorry.
May I take a minute to give you some questions that came in via the Zoom channels, and then I'll continue with the microphone. Cornelia Aust, Steinheim Institute for German Jewish History, Essen, at Bielefeld University, is saying, "Thank you for a great lecture. I was wondering if you could say a few more words about the distinction between Sephardim and Ashkenazim, like in the Yom Kippur scene in Picart's depictions. Isn't it telling that, like many of his contemporaries, he considered Sephardim very much compatible with Dutch/European society, but Ashkenazim much less so?"
Right. So that's a standard view for all early modern Christians observing Jewish communities. That and there's certainly a lot of truth to that. It's kind of interesting, though. So we can assume that that's basically correct, but when you going from that perspective, and then if you study, he has a few images of the Ashkenaz in Amsterdam, and if you study them carefully, okay, so he did choose to do Yom Kippur among the Ashkenaz, not among the Sephardi. So that may say something, but nonetheless, I don't think we're in the another thing to know is a lot of times Sephardi do have beards and do not have the clean-shaven face. And so that's a point. But I think this image is handled with a tremendous amount of admiration for this moment in Kol Nidre. I've spent a lot of time with this image, and he's also. This is one other thing to say about this. This is. The Obene Shul in Amsterdam. This is not the major Ashkenaz synagogue. So this is a smaller one. It's stated often that poorer Ashkenazi Jews were members of this synagogue as opposed to being members of the Great Synagogue, which is the major Ashkenazi synagogue in Amsterdam. And yet, he chose to portray poverty in the Sephardic synagogue in The Hague. So I don't know, So I can't say anything definitive. I'm not willing to just to dive into and accept that differentiation from his perspective of the status of the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi. But it was definitely the Sephardi who became a source for his study of Judaism.
Thanks, David, for a tremendous talk. I learned a lot. The projects that you're writing about feel very anthropological, right? And it feels, and that's early for this kind of depiction. And the first one is interesting because they've asked someone to describe their own culture, right? And then when you get to the encyclopedia, it's an external observer describing other cultures. So I wondered if you could reflect on that.
That this material is based on self-descriptions?
So the text that you were describing.
Modena's text?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's autoethnography, somebody writing about themselves versus someone who's an external observer describing a society.
Right. It's very Modena. He says he's trying to be objective, even though he concedes his identity as being a rabbi, and it's sort of an interesting two different approaches to this kind of writing. On the one hand, he says that he wants to pretend. He says he's going to pretend as if he's not a Jew. The Rabbi Modena writes that at one point. But on the other hand, he says that he, and then especially his Christian editors, say this is reliable because this is a real rabbi who's giving us an account of what Jews do. It's interesting. One of the things that's interesting about his description of Jewish customs, Modena's, I get into in two other chapters, not here. Is that he does depict, Modena depicts Judaism as being very open to Christian sociability, and it's kind of interesting. He says, for example, that there's nothing in Halakha which would forbid Christians from drinking wine together with Jews or handling wine and that sort of thing. So it's very interesting how open he is about that. But one of the reasons that the self-reporting is important is that that most of the comprehensive, but not all, the comprehensive guides of Judaism several of them had been written by former Jews. And so they were claiming inside knowledge, and they could prove that the Jews were nefarious and had all of these destructive anti-Christian customs. And so because they were relying on that kind of identity, it appears especially from the editor's paratext for his publications, that Modena was being presented as an antidote to the former Jew. So that made the self-reporting powerful. It is sort of the beginning. Now this work here is, because it's an attempt to study the religions of the entire world, is often looked at from an ethnographic perspective, but not so much the Jewish part of it. The Jewish part is recognized as the most carefully done part of this survey of world religions, and the others. So we get reports on religions from the Americas and across Europe, Asia, Africa, but.
Thanks so much, David. I really enjoyed this. My question is about marketing, because you mentioned the inquisitorial license, and I was wondering if there are other ways in which this sort of publicistic effort was promoted, either at the level of, to whom it was sold, whether the price put it in a range that certain people would have been able to buy it, or whether certain copies were given away on particular occasions for, ceremonial purposes or to other ends of dissemination.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
So the material we looked at wouldn't be used as gifts, but some of the stuff that Modena did and others would have been as gifts, especially things like sermons given in the presence of the Queen of England, was definitely printed by the Sephardi in Amsterdam for presentation, for sure, that sort of thing. But most of the time, the Modena stuff is really cheap. These are the most they're really poor. I wish I actually have a copy of the first edition in my library. It's so cheaply printed, it's unbelievable. And it would have cost very little money. And these would have been marketed to scholars, Christian clergy would have bought them, people interested in just learning about Jewish communities that are now being formed all around them, people who are promoting a pro-Jewish policy. So that stuff is uniformly, cheaply printed, even in all the different languages. With one of the Dutch editions has a few illustrations. But this grand project by Picart was extraordinarily expensive. And we have prices for it. It's traded for as much as 150 guilders, which would be more than it would be, I think a professor might have made 300 guilders or so at that time. So, but annual salary, extraordinary deluxe work. And these were sold. So the first edition, I think it's thought that it was printed in 1,500 copies, sold at a great at a really high cost, and it was extremely successful. It was a huge. It was definitely important for Modena. That would have gone. We have survival of a lot of these things in royal libraries or princely libraries. It was immediately a collector's items. Now some of the knockoffs. So Picart got pirated. And some of these pirated copies, they recut, so they would copy the engravings and they would reset the text, sometimes edit the text. And those would have been much cheaper. And especially it has a very strong reception history in the English language. And some of the English adaptations of Picart would be on the cheap side. And then those would be just sort of, as I'm saying, just people who are generally interested in the history, generally interested in religions around the world, which you see at this period, a really broad interest in religion. So the average, this out of reach, for sure. But copied and copied. And then the individual engravings will reappear in other works. Even in porcelain, sometimes ceramic, it gets copied.
Hi, David. This is Michael. A fascinating discussion and wonderful story about the rise of toleration in ways that are beautifully surprising. But to my mind, the 17th century, most of the 17th century, was about a century of intolerance. That is, the campaign against Catholics in England, and then between the Protestant denomination and the Church of England, the Civil War, the Commonwealth, the Treaty of Westphalia allows religious monopoly. All you got to do is compensate somebody you kick out of your country. And then, of course, culminating in the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1688. So we get all of these ferocious religious battles based upon intolerance, and yet we have this story of toleration. And my question for you is this a product simply of the fact that the Jewish community was no political threat, unlike Catholics in England or Protestants in France, or is there some other reason why we see this beautiful flourishing of toleration in the midst of strong discrimination?
Yeah, thank you. One point of clarification: a lot of times when I'm referring to toleration, it's legal toleration. It wouldn't be a kind of philosophical, theological reflection, but this legal toleration. And it definitely expands for Jews. Sometimes when Christians suffer expulsion, like with the Edict of Nantes and in other terrible things during the 30 Years' War and many other contexts. So every once in a while, we have documents that say they tolerate the Jews, but they won't tolerate us. So we have that definitely is observed sometimes. So some of the reasons. So so the Edict of Nantes is problematic, and I wouldn't apply what I'm going to say to what happens in the Edict of Nantes. But of course, Picart is a victim of the Edict of Nantes. Benage, I didn't go into that. Benage is a victim of the Edict of Nantes. He has to flee as well. And this is one of the things that makes Amsterdam a kind of really a refuge for people who have been expelled. Some people think that the Edict of Nantes displaced more people than did the expulsion of Jews from Spain. It's such a massive event. But sometimes, but what happened otherwise? One of the important things that happened in the 17th century for Jewish interests was the rise of the court Jew. So in the context of all of this violence, all of these wars, there's a gradual development of a kind of a highly successful class of Jews who were able to undertake really sophisticated military provisioning, and then we're also able to do really important provisioning for courts. And these so-called court Jews, it's not a tremendous number, but they were unusually successful in the context of absolutist courts, so in absolutist governments. And then the wonderful thing about the court Jews is that they felt a responsibility to support their fellow Jews. And we have example after example of a court Jew working to promote Jewish interests. But at any rate, this is a major. In some cases, the beginning of a readmission of Jews is permission for the court Jew to reside in the vicinity of the court, and then a Jewish community would grow in that context. So that's one thing where all the hardships work to the advantage of Jews. The other thing, which is a little bit later than from what you're referring to, that's very advantageous for Jews, is just the realization among Christians that they're going to have to find a way to tolerate each other. And then in that context, Jews benefit from the necessity in Christian societies to increase toleration for different kinds of Christianities, Judaism is typically then legally recognized in that kind of thing. It's just so hard. There were places in Europe where different forms of Christianity were legal, but not too many in this period. And sometimes the only religious minority was the Jewish community. But that's into the 17th century as the Jewish communities are starting to recover after all the expulsions of the 16th century. Is that a start to answer? Yeah.
Michael, thank you so much for your talk. It's Jorge. I'm back here. Sorry, David. Thank you so much for your talk. It's Jorge Coronado.
I'm flattered to be mistaken.
Michael's behind me. David, I wanted to ask about a question that may be unfair.
Don't ask a hard question.
No, I didn't say hard. I said unfair. It may be a silly question, but I think you followed both Modena and Picart's intent, which, as I understand it, is to communicate an image of Jewish people that could travel well and adapt itself to Christians. Right? In both cases, it seems to me. And so it seems that you've shown that, right? Entirely. I follow your argument, and I see what you're telling us about these images. I'm curious, though, because these are books of many different sorts, and you pointed out there's many imprints. I'm curious about what Jewish people may have said about these images, what the reception was amongst them, because you can intend a book for a certain audience, but books circulate. So I'm curious if that was even a factor, if it's something you know about.
Yeah.
Thanks.
We don't know a lot, but one thing we know about the Modena Guide to Judaism, there's absolutely no Jewish reaction to it, and it's amazing. Maybe 40 imprints. There's no Jewish reaction to it. It's really. But it was obviously it was written for Christians. In an obituary, his grandson celebrated Modena as the man who was better known among the Christians than among us. And this is kind of interesting because Modena was a very famous Jew among Jews, but he was just so much more celebrated in the Christian world across Europe. Now, as far as these images go for Judaism, for Jewish reactions to them, there is some knowledge, but it's kind of been it sort of doesn't tell us a whole lot. The Jewish ownership and that sort of thing, but we don't have people praising these works at that time. But definitely. These images were very interesting to Jews. One thing, I'll tell you what I suspect. Before Picart, we have good evidence that Jews are actually commissioning images of Judaism, individual Jews, and commissioning images of the Esnoga, for example. And I suspect that Curiel could easily have been very interested in this project because it was a way to really glorify his family even more. So a good bit of it can be connected directly to Curiel contributions to the Jewish community in Amsterdam. So we don't have a lot of, but we have some knowledge of this. But I find it interesting that Modena, not a single word said. It's recorded.
One more question, perhaps?
This is a very simple question. I was wondering about the format. Because how large were these books and how large are these etchings? Because we see them very, very large now on our screen, which is, of course, a privilege. But I wonder whether they were, whether people put them on their walls or whether they had a look at them like a ceremony to look into a thick book means something different than looking just at an etching on a wall. So the practice of viewing these images has been intriguing for me. And the format.
Yeah, good question. I actually own this book, and these pictures are from my copy. It's very heavy. It's about, it's a big folio. It's like this. My wife was going to bring the copy with her. She visited me a couple weeks ago. But since my luggage was lost by Swiss Air and she couldn't carry it on, she decided not to do this. So I was going to show you the book. So you definitely could buy they are etching engravings. It's a combined technique, as you seem to be aware. And do you see this fold here? This is one plate. It's not bound into the book block. This book was designed. They printed the folios, and then with a blank, and that blank was turned into a stub. And then the stub was used to mount. It's very sophisticated, the mounting here. So it's a perfect opening in the book. It's extraordinary design. So it's a perfect opening. And they sold them, and so they made, and it's on much higher quality paper than the paper of the book. All of them. And they were being offered for sale as individual prints, and then that would allow you to do this. And then, of course, they survived so well in the books. And they would have been treasured parts of elegant libraries. So is that good? Yeah. But it's very interesting. And by the way, so did you notice the dates are 1725 for some of them? The book was printed in 1723. They had designed it all, but he couldn't get all the plates done. Apparently, you just have to assume that's the case. And then they got added in later.